Marvel Select action figure review. Now I have to say, despite a rocky start for 2023, Diamond Select have really started to pump out their Marvel figures over the last couple of months. Over the last month on my channel, I've been able to cover the Super Skrull, the Red Hulk, and today, Apocalypse. Next week, I'll be taking a look at Iceman because there's plenty more scheduled to come this year, including two important members of the Fantastic Four. But right now, let's refocus on today's figure, which is, of course, Apocalypse. Now, I was really excited when this figure was announced. Apocalypse is one of my favourite X-Men villains, and of course, it is the 60th anniversary of the X-Men this year, so it seems only appropriate that he get the Marvel Select treatment. However, that being said, when he arrived in his packaging, I have to say, I was a little bit disappointed and underwhelmed. He seemed a little bit smaller than I was expecting, and some of the proportions looked ever so slightly off. But before we get into all of that today, let's start off by taking a look at this packaging itself. Now, of course, it is in the standard oversized Marvel Select packaging we all know and love. It has the pretty consistent branding that we know by now. It has that sort of collage effect in the background. It is tinted red this time. Of course, it has a big chunky Apocalypse writing there, and it has that little icon, that image of Apocalypse taken from the comic books in the left-hand corner. Of course, most of it is in that blister packaging, so we can see the figure itself in all of its glory, alongside all of his various accessories. Now, I've always been a big fan of the Marvel Select approach to their side panels. There's a lot of space here and they don't waste it. In fact, they don't cover anything in any text whatsoever. We just have a nice strong image of the action figure, or sometimes comic book art of that character. That means for me, they stack up very nicely on the shelf when you put them side by side, and they look colourful and interesting when you're trying to save some space. And speaking of space saving, once again, this is a slightly narrower panel than we're used to seeing from Marvel Select. We've seen this in some of the more recent releases where they've been quite thin line. This was usually reserved for their, say, Disney Store exclusives, where the packaging was ever so slightly thinner and slimmer. And this works very well, as it means you can get more of these figures on your shelf, but you lose nothing in terms of overall presentation. And speaking of the presentation, of course, they have opted for a photo of the figure with some kind of interesting background behind him. So this looks colourful, it looks attractive, and I think they've picked a nice photo. Would I have preferred a comic book image? Yes, probably, because it would have been more consistent with previous releases, but since they've started doing this, that's pretty much standard in recent years, I'm quite happy to accept this. When we flip the packaging to look at the reverse, we can see, again, they've adopted that collage in the background, taking a number of different images from Apocalypse in the comic books from across all the years. I quite like this approach, I think this works really quite nicely. And then we have another couple of stock photo images of the figure itself, which look pretty nice. And then there's a little bit of bio underneath that second image. So most of this is text-free, it's pretty presentable, I think it looks pretty nice on display, and it's very colourful and bright. So there's not much more I think you could ask for here. At the top of the video I mentioned I had some slight reservations about the proportions of this figure. They certainly became much more muted once I got him out of the packaging. And I have to say, this figure has really impressed me. Starting with the head sculpt, I think they've done a pretty tremendous job. Now, as we know, when you're basing a comic book character on the comics, there's been a lot of artists who've interpreted that character across the years, so he's had a number of different looks. But I have to say, this is pretty much what I think of when I think of Apocalypse. I think they've got everything pretty much spot on here. I really like how the lines on the top of his head and around his lips leading up to his ears there, they're actually sculpted in, which is a nice touch, gives it a little bit more depth, which is fantastic. But I think the expression on his face, that snarling, sneering look with the teeth, works really well. Likewise, the paint apps are really nicely applied and the skin tone is pretty much spot on for this character. The yellow of the eyes was a little bit hesitant about at first, but I have to say it actually works overall, and I think they've created something pretty spectacular here. This looks spot on for what I think of as Apocalypse. The sculpting for the entire figure is pretty consistent. Every line, every groove, every bit of detail that you can see on this figure is sculpted in. They've then capitalised on this fantastic sculpting with wonderful paint apps, and what I think is really impressive about this figure in particular is that not only do we see a mix of different paints and different colours being used, we have several shades of blue ranging from the very dark to the lighter to the mid-range. as well as some silvers and of course shading as well to give us some more texture and depth. But there's also a different style used throughout the figure as well. We have a lot of matte paints here which give this a very textured feel to it, and they've combined this with a number of glossy paints throughout various select areas on the figure as well to give it that slick texture, which is really interesting. So what we have is these contrasting styles, these contrasting paint styles that come together to give a very nuanced, very textured, detail heavy appearance for this figure. And this remains true for the entirety of the figure. But one of the things I did want to point out is the ball joints on the ankles there. They look a little bit noticeable, they don't look quite right, they look a little bit incongruous and maybe ever so slightly out of proportion with the rest of the figure. And that's something I wanted to talk about because I mentioned at the top of the video how in the packaging something just seemed a little bit off, and I think that was really because his big collar at the top of his neck there makes the figure look a little bit more stumped and stunted, whereas he has these very long elongated legs. But interestingly, I have to say that once I put him on display, I don't notice it at all anymore. Maybe I've become used to it, I'm not sure, but now it seems absolutely fine. But I do know my first impression was that that seemed a little bit off. I also briefly want to touch on his coils because you'll notice that the ones coming from his waist are actually glued into position, they're non-removable, but when they link up to the gauntlets, these actually do pop out quite easily. They're supposed to for various features that we'll see a little bit later, but also this is to aid articulation. Again, we'll see that a little bit later because the coils themselves are actually quite stiff. They're made of more of a plasticky kind of rubber as opposed to that soft, bendy, malleable rubber that we're used to seeing in, say, Marvel Legends line. So let's look at the articulation. He does have a ball joint at the top of the head. Now you might think, oh, he's going to be much more limited because of that big, thick collar, and to a certain degree that is true, but actually there's still a huge range of motion here, being able to move from side to side, twist it left and right, and even nod it up and down a pretty healthy distance too, which is nice to see. Now he's got ball joints in the shoulders, so of course those arms do lift up and out, and as you can see the coils will pop out, but as you'll see in a moment they do slide back in even when his arms are lifted fully extended, which is great. Now he's got the complementary bicep swivel. He's got actually a pin swivel at the lower arm, which is we're seeing this increasingly with Marvel Select figures, which I'm not a huge fan of, but that arm will rotate all the way around and it will bend to about 90 degrees, although mine is a little bit stiff. And then of course his hand is also another pin swivel, so that will rotate all the way around, and it's hinged, so of course you can lift it up and down. Now as you can see here, the coil will lift back into place and it will keep its shape more or less, which is fantastic. He's got 2 points of articulation in the torso. He has this upper ball joint in the chest area, allowing him to move from side to side, lean left and right, and of course bend forwards and backwards. But he also has a straight swivel at the waist as well, so again he can rotate all the way around. So there's actually a lot of movement here in this area, which is absolutely fantastic. There's ball joints in the hips, of course they will kick out to the side, they'll kick forwards and backwards. There is also that thigh cut at the top of the thigh there as well, so that will swivel from side to side. And then at the lower leg, you can see there is another pin swivel. So this lower leg will move from side to side, it will bend, it will hinge to about 90 degrees as well. And then finally, we have this ball joint at the ankle that allows the foot to hinge forwards and backwards, but also rock and tilt from side to side. I'm really pleased to say that Diamond Select have really thought this through and given him a number of meaningful accessories as well, which is really fun and actually quite unexpected. So he comes with an extra pair of closed fists, a drill bit arm, a vice arm, and a mace hand. I think these are all really fun, creative choices on Diamond Select's part. It's really nice to see some of these appendages that we've seen in the comic books across the years, but something I actually tend to forget is something that Apocalypse can do. But it's really cool to see it replicated here, and this is something I think this figure has over some of the Marvel Legends versions of this character across the years. This isn't something they've ever really particularly explored too heavily, and it's really nice to see that Marvel Select have picked up on that and really ran with it. Now whilst the mace arm just plugs in with its pin into the socket, the other arms, the drill bit arm and the vice arm, operate slightly differently. First of all, you need to remove the hand that's in place, simply grab it and tease it loose. Then disconnect the coil from the bottom of the gauntlet, and then slide the gauntlet off. And then you'll see there is this big, thick, chunky peg that slides into the hole on the accompanying appendage. They just squeeze that in, make sure it's nice and tight, and then reattach the coil to the bottom of the peg hole. Of course, you can swap these out and have them on either arm, it doesn't matter which, or if you prefer, you can have them on both. Either way, it's going to look pretty cool and quite impressive, and there's a number of different options here to create a variety of different looks for this character when you put him on display, which makes him really fun and nuanced and makes him endlessly entertaining. He's definitely a figure you're going to want to come back to again and again just to shake up his various different looks, and he always looks super impressive on display no matter what you do with him. And part of that, of course, is because he is an oversized figure. He's actually significantly taller than other Marvel Select figures. So here he is standing next to Magneto from the Marvel Select line. As you can see, he's got a clear couple of inches over Magneto here. Magneto stands at approximately 7 inches tall, and of course Apocalypse is coming in roughly about 9 inches. This looks really good in terms of scaling. I think this looks pretty appropriate. Of course, Apocalypse can change his size, so it's difficult to pin him down, but if we put him next to the Hulk here, you can see that the Hulk is probably just fractionally taller than Apocalypse, but again, I think in terms of the scaling, this works quite well here. Maybe in my head, Apocalypse is actually slightly bigger than the Hulk, but as I said, both of these characters can vary in size, and this is approximate. I think this works pretty well. However, if you want to increase the scaling, what you can do is stick him next to your Marvel Legends figures in that 6-inch scale, and of course I'm using Wolverine here, who's slightly shorter in that 6-inch scale. It probably comes in about 5 inches tall, and this looks really cool. I really like this. I think this differential works really well for these two figures, so this is really fun if you want to make your Apocalypse seem even bigger. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't note the other Apocalypses, or Apocalypsi, that are available on the market. Of course, Marvel Legends have produced several Apocalypses across the years. Most recently, they did this Retro Wave Apocalypse, which I did a review of on my channel. I'm a big fan of this figure. I think it works really well, but of course, it's in a much smaller scale, and it's lacking a little bit when it comes to paint apps. It certainly doesn't have the texture and depth that this Apocalypse does, and of course, it doesn't have the same height. Likewise, that Apocalypse is obviously a variation on another Builder figure that came from Marvel Legends in recent years. Again, the design is obviously much more of a modern interpretation, whereas this version that we have from Marvel Select is a traditional, more original look for the character when he first debuted in the comic books many years ago. But I did also want to point out that, of course, I think my all-time favourite Apocalypse figure is still going to be the Toy Biz Marvel Legends Builder figure, and certainly, you know, in terms of some of those ball joints, particularly in hips, you know, it isn't the most sophisticated figure in the world. I think actually this Marvel Select version is probably massively improved when it comes to the overall proportions, the articulation, the various accessories, but for sheer scale, that Builder figure will always maintain the number one spot for me, I think, until there's another figure that's made in a comparable size, because that figure stood about 15 inches tall, if I remember correctly. It's quite an impressive figure, and one of my all-time favourites. But I have to say, all things being considered, for me, this is a 5-star figure. Yes, it's got that coveted spot that I very rarely give out 5 stars, and although this figure still has some very minor issues, overall, I think this is tremendously impressive. I was really anticipating this figure, so my expectations were set fairly high. I had that initial disappointment when I saw the packaging. I was like, he's a little bit smaller than I thought, and something about the proportions looked slightly off. But opening him up and putting him on display, I'm super impressed with him. I love the sculpting. I love the paint apps and the contrasting between the various paint apps they've used. And I think the number of accessories that he comes with, combined with his ability to be fully articulated, is just, it's pitch perfect, really. I think they've managed to walk that line and do something for everyone and please everyone. So I think this is absolutely fantastic. I love this figure to bits. It's probably up there as one of my favourite Marvel Select releases in recent years. This is absolutely stupendous, and I can't say enough good things about it. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.